Hi, Danny. It's so amazing to have you on the podcast. Just thank you so much for joining us at Task. It's a real privilege and a real honor, and I can't wait to dive into some of these questions with you. Just to give people a bit of backstory, I'm sure lots of people will know who Danny is. But they are an autistic, queer person. They're a gamer. They call themselves a geek and an esports fan, an animal lover. So much to it. You're also an existential coach. You specialize in neurodiversity, LGBTQ plus issues, self-esteem, and creativity. And then you're also the deputy principal of the NSPC, which is the new School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in London, for people that aren't aware. And we will probably be using that acronym moving forward. You're also the registrar, you're the course leader of the MA in diversity studies. You're a research supervisor, you're a teacher. You just must be so busy with all of that.
Well, I'm not the course leader for diversity studies anymore. That was a really temporary thing, actually, that I stepped into. So I should
Right.
correct that slightly. But but yes, the reason things like that creep in is because I do wear far too many hats.
I can imagine. Thank you. Um, yeah, so, and I think I just want to acknowledge kind of where I come into this conversation. So I'm a straight, white, cis, heterosexual, neurotypical man. I've had a lot of privilege in my life. Maybe there might be a bit of a power dynamic, and I just wanted to acknowledge that, and maybe we can check in on that and see how we get on. Um, Great. So just kind of just to dive in then. So when you think about your own, um, before they do that, sorry, could you just kind of, so we've mentioned kind of autistic and queer. Could you give us a sense of kind of what those mean for you?
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of queerness, I'm sort of holding two things at once there. So, usually when we talk about queerness, we're talking about the full kind of spectrum of LGBTQ plus identities, which encompasses a huge amount of different experiences and identities. From my perspective, I'm both bisexual and genderqueer. So, two quite difficult to pin down identities that have their own particular nuances.
Mm.
And then I am a quite late diagnosed autistic person as well.
Mm.
And of course, with that comes lots of nuance too. I'm really big on nuance. I'll probably be repeating that word such that we forget what it means. So apologies in advance for this. But it's a bit of a hobby horse for me.
That's absolutely fine. And I know what you mean. There's you have to get the details exactly right, I think, and
Yeah.
lots of things. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and then it kind of could you talk about so that was kind of queerness. Do you have a sense of kind of what you as an autistic person, what that identity means for you?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, all sorts of things, and not completely separate from the queerness as well. I know we're going to
Mm.
talk a little bit about that,
Mm.
and the sort of the overlaps and intersectionality there, and there is a very strong overlap between those identities. Um, but I suppose in terms of the autism, it's almost like a label for lots of different parts of my experience. So some of that is around, I guess, my experience of being an outsider, being slightly on the outskirts of things throughout my entire life, not quite being able to tune into the sort of the status quo or the social norms, and having that sense of being just on the outside. Um, what some people would have called eccentric in times gone by. But now we sort of know is often a kind of neurodivergence of some sort when people present in that way. But also, I mean, I think in a funny way, that part of it is easier to frame in a kind of positive, affirming light, right? Because you can talk about creativity, you can talk about originality when you're outside of the box, it gives you certain advantages. But I also don't want to wash over some of the challenges of being autistic as well, because again, nuance. There are challenges and good things. And some of the challenges are around what's called executive function. So all of the kind of bits that are almost like our inner personal assistant does for us, things like prioritizing, memory, those sorts of things, can be a really big challenge. one example of that is that I have, I'm going to be very honest in this interview.
Wonderful.
Um, one of the ways that manifests is that I can never keep on top of my laundry. It's there is a big pile in my room always of some clean laundry, some dirty laundry. There is some order to the chaos, but it is chaos.
Mm, mm,
And part of being an autistic person or a neurodivergent person is really kind of recognizing those limitations and then being able to put things in place to kind of mitigate them to a certain extent, but not falling into the trap of thinking that we just haven't tried hard enough or somehow we're going to mystically solve this issue.
mm,
Because it's kind of inherent to us.
mm. That makes a lot of sense. It feels like you've accepted that this is me, and it's not an issue, but it's part of me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I can still look at the pile of laundry and feel shame from time to time. um,
Yeah.
that's absolutely human and a given, I think.
Mm. Well, that really kind of goes into kind of my next kind of question was around, and we talked about before, kind of, do we kind of separate queerness and autistic and your autistic identity? And my thinking is that we're kind of we'll frame the questions as both, and then we can go into the details and the nuances you say. So on top of kind of that really specific, really helpful anecdote around the laundry, are there other narratives, stories, memories you've got around this is what I understand by my being queer, my being autistic that you can tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, so many.
Right.
One of the one of the sort of common experiences that people have so I came out later in life as well. So I did all of this stuff in my 30s, and what tends to happen, both with coming out with a queer identity, but also in getting a diagnosis of autism or another neurodivergent condition, what often happens is that you go through this process of looking back on your life through the lens of this new knowledge. And it is shocking what you find when you go through
Right.
the process. Um, so one of the things that sort of bubbles up to the surface when you ask that question, if I think about the autistic part, um, one memory that would often come back to me, but I couldn't really make sense of it until I'd gotten the diagnosis, um, is being in secondary school. And basically, I found out years after something happened that people had thought that it was weird and that they'd been talking about it the whole time and making fun of me to my face and me being completely oblivious to it. And the thing that I did that people picked up on, I mean, secondary school is just so relentless, isn't it? You can't get away
Yeah.
with it. Was that in the middle of a class at some point when we were having a class discussion, I threw in something about how I really like camping because I really like the sound of the rain on the canvas at night. Apparently, this was a weird thing to say in that context. Now, looking back through my awareness now of neurodivergence, I can see that there were lots of different things going on there all at the same time. There was a sensory thing of me getting really absorbed in remembering that sensory experience and having very strong feelings about it and wanting to share it. That thing about not quite filtering my thoughts, not realizing that um, that the other kids in that group would have been filtering and censoring and not sharing these kinds of experiences, and then also not being able to read the room for like years afterwards and realizing that people were making fun of me in front of my face. Now that's quite a benign example, but I think it encompasses a few things at once. In terms of queerness, um, gosh, on a gender level, I remember going back through very obsessively in beautiful autistic fashion once I had made this discovery about myself, going back over diaries, over WhatsApp chat logs that I'd had with friends, and sort of piecing together the evidence, so to speak. And one of the things that really struck me when I was looking back at some of these old chats was there was a moment where I'd been speaking to my best friend and we were joking about our souls and what our souls were like. And I started describing my soul as she, her. And I stopped myself and I said, actually, I think my soul is male, and then just carried on and like didn't think anything of it because for me, actually, I kind of always knew this stuff about myself gender wise. Um, and I wasn't sort of too concerned about it. It was when I started talking about it to other people and they became concerned about it that it became an issue, which is an interesting dynamic. And then in terms of queerness, I think, well, in terms of queerness, I just talked about queerness. In terms of bisexuality, um, one of the memories that comes to mind, again, in this trawling through lots of information in a sort of obsessive manner, I found a list that my one of my best friends and I had done years and years ago when I was in university of things that we liked and things that we didn't like. Um, and it's a ridiculous list. I mean, it should not be taken seriously. Um, but one of the things that we listed that we didn't like was bisexuality. And the reason that we put on there
Mm,
was best of both worlds, which is
I
really
see.
interesting statement.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like screaming, I want to claim this identity, but I don't feel that I can. Like, this is the best of both worlds. There's clearly a draw towards this. And yet, I have to say that it's something that I don't like.
That's so yeah, there's so much richness in that and the kind of the I suppose contradiction there of like of kind of how that fits together. Um wow. Um I'm That's so interesting. And I can really see some parallels between the stories of like, okay, I can see how they might kind of have some commonalities and have and people that have one identity might be more likely to have another.
Hmm.
Um, I'm curious, do you kind of see a relationship between those identities? Kind of is one maybe more important to you than the other? Has one been more difficult to hold, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's really hard to pick apart. I think they are kind
Mm,
of inherently linked. And this is
mm,
why there is some discussion in the autistic community, particularly around this term autigender, which is the idea that your experience of your gender can be so inherently linked to your autistic identity that it's impossible to completely separate them out. Um, and I can kind of relate to that to an extent. I think there's a degree to which they are inherently linked, and it's really difficult to kind of unpick one from the other. But in terms of, I guess, the impact that they've had on me or my um, difficulty in holding those different identities, it's weird. It's like I think as a teenager, the sexuality part was the hardest because firstly, I went to school completely under Section 28 in the UK, so there was no education or discussion of different identities. Secondly, there wasn't really much media representation aside from like very stereotypical depictions of usually cis white gay men. Um, so there wasn't a lot of kind of openness to different identity for me to be able to actually know that this was what was going on. And it was easier for homophobic bullying to take place in schools because teachers, were at risk actually stepping in and having those conversations with people. So, in terms of the impact, I think sexual orientation was the thing that probably gave me the most difficulty and angst in an obvious way as a teenager in trying to navigate that. But it's interesting, again, even for somebody who is non-heterosexual, it's often really difficult to pick apart the gender completely from that equation anyway, because even though I didn't know about myself that I was gender fluid at that time and there were no discussions about that, the bullying that I got as somebody who was closeted but clearly reading as queer um, was quite gendered. It was quite, I would get called butch all the time. I was asked whether or not I was a man. Like they're kind of even in the discrimination. Those two things are often linked. There's often a policing of you're not doing this correctly. You're kind of slightly outside. and that's a problem for other people. Um, with the autism thing, I don't know. I think it's impossible for me to understand what life as a neurotypical. I can kind of understand what it would be like to live life as a cisgender person and as a heterosexual person because I kind of tried to do it.
Right. I see.
Whereas with the autism thing, I think it's too difficult to even really properly mask. You kind of know you're masking while you do it. I don't know.
Right.
It's a subtle difference there for me that I can't quite put my finger on. But
Yeah.
I've rambled a bit. What I was intending to say when you asked me the question was the sexuality thing, I think, was more difficult for me to unpick later on because that had been the subject of a lot of the kind of bullying experiences that I'd had, something that I really struggled to own about myself. The gender thing hadn't been such a struggle to own about myself. I kind of knew it, but as soon as I started speaking about it, the wider general public, people that I encountered, or people in my life in general, were much more accepting of the sexual orientation thing and had a lot more kind of questions, I suppose, about the gender thing, which
Right.
is interesting because it's totally the opposite of what was actually going on for me. And
Yeah. There's another kind of point of difference, not just of in identity, but actually how people approach them.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. Um, I wondered if we could kind of move into kind of your experience in the coaching and academic world and kind of as a bit of a segue, what's it been like to kind of have those identities and then start or maybe you weren't out yet, but to hold those identities in the coaching academic world that you're also in.
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, arguably, I kind of grew up in those worlds because I
Right.
grew up in a family where I have four parents, effectively, two step parents and two biological parents, and all of them are academics, and
Right.
all of them are involved or have been involved in psychotherapy, psychology, or philosophy.
Interesting.
So that was kind of my world anyway. And because I didn't come out and I didn't have a diagnosis until my 30s, I kind of navigated those worlds and became a coach and got involved on that level myself too, um, without knowing those things about
Mm,
myself, without having claimed those aspects of my experience.
mm,
When I did start to claim those aspects of my experience, I was very clear that I wanted to do that in a very open way because I think I recognize the immense privilege that I hold. So even though obviously those are ways in which I don't hold privilege, but I do hold privilege in the sense that I'm very middle class, I'm white, I'm educated, all
mm,
of those things. And so it was really important to me to use that privileged aspect to hold some of those more what's the right word? Well, I don't know, some of those different aspects of my identity in a public way so that I was visible, so that I wasn't then kind of continuing to hide those things and perpetuate a system where we don't give people with those identities much of a voice or a platform. I felt very strongly that I needed to just be open about it so that there was somebody who had the privilege of having that platform and being able to kind of hold those aspects of themselves publicly for others to see. And as I say, I think that's been most difficult on a gender level, just because of where we are at the moment in society around
yeah.
these conversations.
Yeah. I imagine there's a lot of people that look to you on kind of their identity as a real role model of, okay, well, Danny's done it, so maybe I can. Was there anyone kind of when you were coming through and thinking, okay, there's someone that's autistic, there's someone that's queer that I can kind of look up to, or even kind of a sense of that at all?
Yeah, definitely. I
Mm.
mean, as an adult looking at academia, there are
Mm.
so many really influential people, and
Mm.
I'm grateful to be able to have had a working relationship with Meg John Barker, for example, who
Right.
was probably one of the first people that I encountered
Mm.
who really owned a non-binary identity. So there are plenty of people out there who are doing it, but I think you often, historically, certainly have had to sort of look hard. It's felt like it's a niche thing
Right.
that you have to kind of search for. And I think I'm hopeful that that might change that.
Mhm.
And the same for any marginalized identity, right? There's a
Mm.
feeling of yeah, it's like pushed into the realm of the niche rather
Mm.
than thinking of it as sort of equally important to any other space that we hold.
Yeah. Kind of a sense of othering, it feels like. Kind of like, okay, well, you can exist, but only in this particular space rather than a kind of more open, you're part of this whole
Yeah,
broader community, I wonder.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's so interesting. Thank you. Um, I wondered kind of so it's absolutely fascinating to hear kind of all your backstory and kind of your journey and your own kind of experiences. I wondered kind of just on a I suppose on a more professional level in terms of your actual your um academic background and kind of your position at NSPC. Um, could you talk a bit kind of about I'm aware you got your master's in existential coaching in 2013.
Mhm.
And without I'm sure and NSPC then was doing some great work, but could you give us a sense of what's changed from your experience of your master's to kind of where NSPC is now and maybe where it's going to be in another 11 years in terms of inclusion and diversity around neurodiversity and queerness?
Mm. Well, obviously, me having graduated from the program and then been in a course leader position with it for many, many years, I have corrupted it with my queer agenda, as any good queer person would do. Um, but joking aside, I do think we've gotten better collectively in education, in training, in terms of, there's a much more focus on having experts by experience, for example, to come and talk about different aspects of their world. So you get more of that kind of subjective experience. Um, I think that we've gotten collectively better at recognizing the problematic nature of certain thinkers as well. That wasn't really happening so much even back in 2013, whereas now it's a thing that our students rightly have pushed us to acknowledge. And something that I'm very careful to acknowledge now when I deliver training in other places as well. So I think a lot has improved in terms of I guess looking critically at the context of thinkers that have, historically dominated the literature. And in terms of getting a little bit of diverse experience injected into training programs. Um, but, having said that, there's obviously a very long way to go. I think what I would like to see is, and obviously I say this as somebody who does have some influence on this, but I'm also just one person.
Mm.
Um, I would like to see less of a kind of objective stance on marginalization and intersectionality, much more subjective experience, but not necessarily by having to bring people outside to be experts by experience, but because we've actually built up a generation of people from marginalized groups who are delivering the training themselves and bringing that awareness into it. So it's not something extra that's coming in, it's actually something that's embedded within a curriculum, that's embedded within the culture of an organization. Again, I think that's getting slightly better, but there's a very, very long road to travel with that. And also, one of the things that I often talk about when I'm delivering training, and again, another one of my hobby horses, sorry, um, is recognizing the wisdom that comes out of a marginalized group's specific experience. So one of the things that I notice particularly when I'm doing autism training for other organizations, is that um, we'll get feedback of like um, people basically saying, okay, I can see that this is an extreme example that you're giving, but actually, I really relate to a lot of these things in general. Don't we all struggle with this to a certain extent? And the answer is yes and no. What I think is that each experience of marginalization kind of brings to the fore particular issues. And those people who deal with that particular kind of marginalization then acquire a hell of a lot of wisdom about dealing with that particular issue because they've had to sit there and think about it, you know. As a genderqueer person, I've had to sit and dissect gender and I've had to understand a lot of things about that that I never would have thought in a million years I would have to look into or think about. Um, and in some ways, that's annoying because it means that you're constantly having to do a lot of work because people just haven't told you things because they wouldn't think to. Um, but it also means that you develop a level of awareness and knowledge and wisdom about something that actually I think pretty much anybody could benefit from. So I kind of like to move away from the standard dialogue that we have at the moment, which is really focusing on the experience of being marginalized and all of the struggles that that creates. That's really important, and I wouldn't want to let go of that. But there's a flip side to that, which is more generative and more about sharing like wisdom and awareness and power in there somewhere,
Mm.
rather than just focusing on the marginalization aspect of it. And take that with a pinch of salt because, as I say, I'm coming from, in some ways, having quite large privilege. So it's kind of easy for me to sit back and say that, right?
Yeah. But it sounds like I suppose it's a more holistic experience that we're trying to communicate, not just as you kind of as you say of marginalization, but how does that fit in with your general experience and maybe some similarities, not just these are all the hard things I've done in life, but this is my life more generally. That's really important to my story as well.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And what can we all learn from this? How does this apply to people across the board? Rather than it just be,
Mm,
again, it's like moving away from that thing, that idea of it being like a niche experience
mm,
where it's kind of I'm trying to think of a way to say this that isn't cynical, but I'm such a cynical human being that it's really impossible for me to do that. Um, it's almost like to be able to sell to people that they need to stand up and pay attention to marginalized people's experience. You kind of have to show them why it applies to them as well, and not just in a way that makes them feel like, oh, I'm being attacked. I have to go on the defensive because I'm being painted as the bad guy here.
mm.
But actually understanding why this stuff benefits us more broadly socially.
Yeah. And kind of emphasizing the commonality, I suppose.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people will have, you know, the phrase "all lives matter" evokes a lot of negative feelings in us all because of how it's
it
used.
does.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that's exactly where kind of the nuance comes in. Of well, there's something about this experience of being queer that is quite unique to me, and there's something about actually it matters to you, even if you don't care about queer people,
yeah,
which is a really sad state of affairs. But
yeah,
it's still interesting to you, and it should still matter to you. Um,
yeah, yeah,
and I think something I've struggled as well as like is that how much of my experience of being male is about maleness and is about being a man, or is this just what everyone goes through?
yeah,
I mean, I thought of this. This might sound a bit of a strange anecdote, but like so I was on a bus, the other day, and someone was being an arsehole, and I thought I'm a white man. There's nothing different about me. Almost lucky me that I didn't have to think, oh, was it because I was this race or this gender? Something I didn't have to think, are they being horrible about a really specific thing, but are they just a really horrible person?
You know what? I
Which
had a very similar experience the other day.
right?
I got pulled over by the police for the first time
Mm,
at the end of last week. And it really disturbed me. A, because it was the first time, so it was a new experience and I had no idea what to expect. B, because I felt that I was being seen as somebody who was, not following the law, that I was being disruptive in some way, which absolutely wasn't my intention. Turned out my lights weren't on. Ridiculous, didn't realise. this is the problem with modern cars. They do it all for you and then you forget. Um,
Yeah.
but I did think after that, like how terrified and appalled I was in that moment and how anxious I was about it. And thinking, yeah, but imagine being in that position, having that threat looming over you, and knowing that you're in a group that are more likely for that to escalate.
Mhm.
Like, I'm white, I'm quite well spoken. I can navigate that situation without feeling like there are all of these other factors that just take power away from me in that position. And still, I felt really scared.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's sounds horrifying, but as you say, kind of in that mix of all these different identities, and as you say, as a white person, that it's obviously it's a huge privilege, but in that really specific situation that we don't think about, kind of.
And also thinking,
Mhm.
this is a part of, I sit under the transgender umbrella. I'm a
Yeah.
non-binary person. I can never quite decide exactly what label to call myself. Sometimes I call
Mhm.
myself genderqueer, sometimes I call myself gender fluid. Guess that kind of indicates that there is some gender fluidity there because it's the terms that I'm using are so fluid. Um but I am not somebody who you would look at in that situation and think, um, that person is trans. You might get a vibe, or it might be something that comes up later. But in terms of being stopped by a police officer, I'm not going to get treated differently because of that part of my identity because it doesn't read.
Right.
Whereas, a trans woman, depending on the trans woman, may
Yeah.
very well find herself in that situation and be
Mm.
discriminated against and have things escalate very quickly.
Mm. Yeah. There
So,
was.
yeah, even though I'm holding a little piece of that identity, there's a lot of privilege there.
That's so fascinating. I, there's a previous episode of the podcast with Mick Cooper and Myra Khan, and I've mentioned that episode in another episode, and it's just wonderful. So Myra was talking about kind of she wears the hijab and it's very visible, and you can tell that she's a Muslim, whereas Mick is Jewish, and he could pass as Christian as non-Jewish,
Mm.
um, and it comes with challenges for both of them because people if someone is actively is Islamophobic, then they're going to, they're going to target someone like Myra.
Yeah,
Um, Whereas for Mick, the issue is when they don't know he's Jewish and they'll say something anti-Semitic, and then you're
yeah,
like, well, you don't know what's going on for me at all. It might, it wasn't directed at him,
yeah,
and he's got it's got its own challenges. So it's a real, it's a, it's got yeah, it's unique kind of if it's visible in your identity or not, and kind of different challenges for both. But as you say, kind of a real privilege for us that. So I'm not trans, but I also don't come across as trans, so it's kind of
yeah.
it does feel like a privilege.
Well, and that's an important distinction to make as well, because of course there are lots of people who aren't trans but do come across as trans and who
Mm.
absolutely do suffer from,
Yeah.
certain aspects of the same discrimination. I know so many um, queer cisgender women who get policed in bathrooms, in some cases have been spat at for using women's toilets just because that's where we're at societally now, where it's like people feel that they can take it upon themselves to essentially police somebody's gender performance.
And does that, I mean, misogyny's been forever, but that feels like, before trans identities before people knew about what trans meant so much, they wouldn't have really made those assumptions. So it's quite a, they would, yeah, they would have just thought, okay, I'm stereotyping a woman with short hair,
Yeah,
in a sense that
yeah,
but because people got that, oh, maybe you're this, maybe you're that, when obviously who the fuck should care? But the fact that they do.
exactly, exactly. But they do. People care very, very
Mm.
deeply, and um, gosh, I don't know. Sometimes I just wish that people would put their care and concern as something that would move us forward rather than feel like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
causing immense amounts of harm.
Mm. Yeah. I'm curious kind of on this kind of topic of maybe some relationships between kind of trans affirming and non-trans affirming people. Um I think I'm really interested in how we kind of manage of kind of respecting people that might have transphobic views or might not understand what being trans means, and not making them feel shut down, but also having a real concern for trans people that their identities feeling safe, their safety often feeling
Yeah.
safe, and kind of their existence not being denied, and how we manage that as a society, as therapists and coaches, and kind of what thoughts you might have around that.
Oh gosh, I mean it's so tricky, isn't it? From my perspective, what I always try to do with these things is to initially give someone the benefit of the doubt that perhaps somebody just hasn't explained something to them or they're not aware of the harm that they may be doing when they say something in a particular way or express a particular view. I do think there's a thing about trying to acknowledge that we're all at different places in our journey of, awareness, understanding about particular topics, whether that's transness or something else. I know I've put my foot in it with plenty of things in my life, and I will continue to do so. Um, but it's about intent. And if somebody has the information and then they continue to do the behavior knowing that it will cause harm, then that's a completely different situation. And at that point, we have to approach it from a different angle and protect people, make sure that they're safe. Um, there's a really fantastic bell hooks quote that I usually use when I'm doing training around gender, particularly, which basically says that. I mean, it's a reference specifically to the feminist movement, but you could use it for any marginalized group. And it is just about that recognizing that we have all been at the beginning of that journey at some point in our lives as well, and that we have to accept that of other people. We have to understand that and work with that and meet people where they are on that particular journey. If they're not interested in going further in that journey and actually understanding things, digesting them, asking questions, all of that lovely stuff, um, then you probably quite quickly at the end of the road there, because there's this more basic issue around dehumanization and recognizing harm to others.
Mm. That's That's just so, yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree. That's a really, I think that's a really great way to frame it. And as you say, if someone, if you can't really give them the benefit of the doubt anymore, then that's it. I think that's so well put. Um, I wanted to kind of, I was just kind of aware of what time we're on. I wanted to kind of just move on to kind of specifically social change and kind of go into kind of the broader kind of maybe political or kind of policy making field. That's okay. Um, so what do you see as the most common challenge? I know we've kind of touched on lots of these, but are there kind of particular challenges that neurodivergent or people with LGBTQ plus identities bring to your coaching practice or to coaching and therapy in general? And then how does that translate into policy making, politics, what we can actually do or continue to do to really support those people?
Um, I think for all of those groups, for all of those experiences, one of the biggest things that people bring, certainly in my coaching practice, is internalized stigma.
Mm.
And that's often one of the biggest things that we have to work through. So, again, from a queer angle and from an autistic angle, that is often one of the sort of centerpieces actually that we end up coming back to again and again and again, is that kind of understanding, deconstructing the ways in which society's attitudes have left us feeling like there's something inherently broken about us. Um, Actually recognizing that that's what's going on in the first place is one piece of the puzzle, and then keeping on noticing and challenging that and challenging our assumptions around that is another piece of the puzzle. Um, in terms of neurodivergence specifically, there's something really important about being able to well, it goes back to my laundry pile. Recognizing our limitations. Um, And developing greater self-compassion around those things as well, both around the internalized stigma and around those limitations. Knowing how to get the best out of ourselves because people won't have necessarily told us how to do that. I mean, again, this translates more broadly, right?
Yeah.
We all grow up not being taught what the best thing for ourselves is, how to work
Mm.
with ourselves, how to recognize our limitations, all of these things. It's just
Yeah.
heightened by an autistic experience where you might have what's called a spiky profile,
Mm.
which is where, there are some things that you're highly, highly competent at.
Mm.
And then other things where you're just kind of like way below the average competency for that thing. So, for example, when I did my assessment, they did a sort of profiling, they used a profiling tool, and it came out really high on things like, ability to engage academically, for example. Um, Actually, my social skills in general are pretty okay, thanks to masking and being able to do all those sorts of things. Um, but a lot of the stuff around self-care was really low. And there's something about this sort of assumptions that we have societally that if you see somebody performing really well in one area, we tend to assume that that's kind of a baseline or that their baseline is not far off from that. In neurodivergent populations, there's a hell of a lot of variation. So being really good at one thing, there's probably going to be a bunch of other things that we really suck at, really struggle with. So unpicking that, understanding that can be really difficult because there's often frustration that will have been expressed to us by other people in our lives, right? Teachers, parents, people in authority who can see that we have a capability in one area and it's why can't you get this other thing? Why can't you just do it? You're not trying hard enough. You're being lazy. Those sorts of things. And again, that feeds into the stigma because, we absorb all of that. Um, so very rambly answer, but but hopefully some sense in there somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So much sense. Um, and I suppose, yeah, my things and things are when you go with that whole, I mean, it's a whole range of experiences and a whole range of challenges people face. And you will say, if you're talking to Morgan McSweeney, say, the big kind of Labour person that's all behind the scenes and lots of people don't like very much because of what Labour are doing, um, do you see kind of specific things, or maybe did you have hope that Labour would do X, Y, Z that they're doing, not doing, or could be doing, do you think, on a policy level?
Well, I have a very complicated relationship with the Labour Party. I ran as a Labour councillor not too long ago, and I'm now no
Wow.
longer a member of the party at all. So, so that tells you a little bit about my political
Mm,
leaning.
mm,
But having said that, a friend of mine, Sarah Owen, the MP for Luton North, has just been made chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee.
mm,
Um, and she's a very sensible person who will take that role very seriously, who is aware of a lot of these issues. And I fully trust her to be able to hold that in the complex way that she will need to hold it as chair. So I think whenever you have I can't even say left leaning because it doesn't quite feel right in terms of my interpretation of the current Labour Party. That's up for debate. But whenever you have, the more left-leaning party in charge, even if it takes a more centrist position, there is an opportunity for progress. And you have a choice about how you engage with that process, whether you're somebody who's going to do that from within the system that's taking over and act as a voice that kind of um, tips it perhaps further into progressive policies, or whether you're going to be on the outside creating pressure from the outside as an activist. But the point is that if you have a uh, a more left-leaning party in power, there is the potential to be influenced in that way. There is the potential for things to shift. I think, unfortunately, where we again, this is my cynicism probably, but I think that where we are at the moment in time and in our culture, in our society, I don't have much hope that we're going to get really progressive governments in certainly in the UK or the US. Um, I think it's really important that we don't just then, throw out all sense of hope or possibility, because it's the starting point. From that starting point, from that slight cultural shift, just slide to a slightly more progressive stance, there is possibility in there. I look at the US election. I'm slightly biased towards this because I'm a US citizen, even though I've never lived there.
Same.
Um, oh, really?
Yeah.
Excellent. But I've been really heartened to learn about what Tim Walls's track record on LGBTQ youth. I mean, it's incredible. So there are pockets of um, brilliance, I think, within those movements that are actually quite progressive. And if we continue applying pressure, either from within or from outside, things will shift gradually. And importantly, the culture as a whole will shift because, when you grow up under, I was born under Thatcher. It was a very different world, and it shows you what's possible. It shows you, it sets the tone in a way for society. So I'm hopeful that as long as we keep voting in people who are at least slightly more left leaning than the alternatives, that you're creating an opportunity for something to shift.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. And it's a kind of what you talk about, kind of bit by bit by bit, is that I think there are some people where they think, and maybe this is my cynicism, is that I look at some people, maybe on the left as well, on all sides, and I think in your mind, if you could just click your fingers and everyone would listen to you, then you could change the whole world. And I'm like, that's a lovely thought, and we need, utopians like that. But actually, change is slow, and it's a grind, and it's a hassle, and it's a nuisance, and it happens slowly, but it does happen.
And I think as lefties, we fall into a massive trap with that as well. Sorry to
Mm,
anybody who's listening who isn't a massive lefty. I happen to be one, so I'm speaking from that perspective. But again, I'm kind of translating this more broadly. So
mm,
my observation of left-wing politics is that people end up falling into similar traps as they're criticizing the right for in some ways. People dig their heels in and get really dogmatic about particular issues. And I understand it, and I'm actually behind them a lot of the time on those issues. I agree with them. But it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we can just kind of um, force that narrative on people and expect them to get on board with it. We can't do that. It doesn't work like that. We have to somehow make it feel accessible, applicable to
mm.
people more broadly.
Yeah. No, I'm completely with you. And I think a lot of that to me, I mean, it comes from maybe a moralistic stance of thinking I'm right, you're wrong, and I was talking to someone the other day about kind of the urban rural divide and kind of Brexit. And people
Yeah.
don't understand like what to feel like you're in a small town, you're going nowhere, the mines are closed, you're really struggling. And to kind of the kind of classic, no, I know you're working based in London, so I don't want to stereotype, but a lot of Londoners think, oh, those silly little villages that are so backwards and so out of date. I'm like, you don't understand what that experience is like. I grew up in a small town. My former MP was one of the key Rwanda people. Like, I really disagree with a lot of the town, but I get kind of where it comes from, and
Yeah,
that's. I mean, hopefully, I think a lot of our hope at Task is that's what Task is about, is that bringing kind of some ideas from therapy and social change of empathy, unconditional
exactly.
positive regard, whatever, actually understanding people, not just how do I change your mind, but understanding first, and then maybe we go into, difference and go from there.
Exactly. I mean, we would never
Mm.
do that as practitioners, right? We wouldn't
Yeah,
like wade in and be like, well, you're wrong, and here's why. Here's my wisdom. We
exactly.
wouldn't dream of doing it. It'd be completely unprofessional and unethical. And yet we kind of feel like with these political ideas, it's somehow okay to do that. I'm not sure that I agree that it is okay to do that in any context. It's trickier because it means that you have to kind of bottle your rage that you feel boiling up when you're speaking to people like that. But you have to understand where they're coming from. You have to understand, and particularly if you're actually a politician, you have to represent that person. You've got to represent them all. So So it's tricky. It's a lot more complicated, I think, than we like to believe.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think that a lot of the time, with some exceptions, that if you can actually have a proper conversation with that person, you're not necessarily going to get to share the same opinion,
Mm.
but at least you can understand what they feel is at threat or what value they're trying to uphold. And in many cases, certainly I think with the sort of trans panic that's going on now, actually a lot of the things that people feel at threat are probably not the things that are actually at threat. And so if you can understand where they're coming from, there is actually room for maneuver in that because you can then have a sensible conversation where they actually know that you've listened and heard.
Yeah. I feel like I could talk to you forever, Danny. There's so much wisdom in everything you share, but I'm really conscious of respecting your time. So yeah, just as I say, thank you so much. I think we might wrap up there if that's all right for you.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much for your time and for sharing everything with us. Most of our listeners are kind of progressive minded therapists, and a lot of this are kind of a lot of them will have some knowledge and a lot of awareness around the issues we've discussed, but I think it'll be really invaluable for a lot of them and a refresher and a piece of education for lots and lots. So yeah, thank you so much, Danny. It's been wonderful.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.